Welcome to Forever and Always Sweet Stories, where every love story ends with a promise and a happy ever after. If you enjoy quiet tension, heartfelt endings, and just the right touch of charm, you're in the perfect place. Make sure to follow or subscribe so you never miss a new chapter. Now settle in and enjoy the story. Chapter 1. The Whitcombe Ball, Mayfair, 1812. The Whitcombe townhouse was ablaze with grandeur, its high ceilings festooned with garlands of jasmine and ivy, while hundreds of beeswax candles glittered from chandeliers above. Beneath them, London's finest turned in swirling circles of silk and gold thread, the music of a 12-piece orchestra soaring and dipping like swallows in spring. Miss Eliza Harland stood just beyond the edge of the dance floor, poised beside a tall display of hothouse roses. She was, by every traditional measure, a beauty, though never one inclined to make a show of it. Her hair, thick and chestnut brown, was pinned in a Grecian knot with delicate silver combs shaped like laurel leaves. A few rebellious tendrils escaped to frame her high cheekbones and a small, stubborn chin. Her skin held the faintest flush of English rose, neither pale nor bronzed, but warm and glowing, as though she had just come in from a gallop across the downs. Her eyes, a striking shade of stormy green, were sharp and knowing, far too intelligent to be easily flattered. She wore a gown of palest blue silk, nearly the colour of frost at dawn, the hem and sleeves embroidered with fine silver beading that caught the light with every breath. The empire waist was cinched beneath her full bust, with a narrow ribbon of white satin. Her gloves reached her elbows. Her slippers were the same hue as her gown, satin and pearl-buttoned. She did not smile, but she did watch. Keenly, unapologetically. "Not dancing, Miss Harland?" a passing matron asked with a simper. "Not yet," Eliza replied smoothly. "The evening is still young, and I dislike wasting good music on poor partners." She turned back to her lemonade, chilled and sharp with a slice of sugared lemon floating on top, and scanned the room again. Her father, Viscount Harland, was across the floor, in conversation with the Earl of Amberley. He was a man of commanding presence even at 58, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, and always immaculately dressed in deep navy and crisp white. Though his eyes had softened in age, they still carried the same piercing green as Eliza's. He had once been considered one of the most handsome men in Parliament, and it was not uncommon to hear that his daughter had inherited the best of both her parents. Lady Harland, gone these 6 years, had been a celebrated beauty of Italian and Irish ancestry, with deep auburn hair and golden skin. Portraits of her still hung in several drawing rooms across the country. Eliza resembled her in the shape of her mouth, full-lipped and curved in a way that looked forever close to a smirk. "Eliza!" came a breathless voice, and Lady Margaret Newcombe burst into view, cheeks flushed and curls flying. She wore pale peach muslin over gold undersilk, with enough lace and ribbon to decorate a chaise. "You must try the raspberry tartlets," she said, tugging her toward the refreshment table. "The cook brought them down from Scotland. And have you seen him?" "Seen whom?" Eliza asked, lifting a tartlet delicately between 2 fingers. The pastry crumbled perfectly, the filling soft and tart with just the right sweetness. "Him, over there, beside Lord Danforth." Margaret's eyes sparkled. "Mr. Ashworth, the one in the black coat." Eliza turned and found herself staring at the man again. He wore his black evening coat as if it were a uniform, cut impeccably over broad shoulders and a trim waist. His waistcoat was deep emerald, embroidered with dark silver thread, and his cravat was tied in a perfect, simple knot that suggested he had no interest in frivolity. His hair was a rich, dark brown, not quite black, and brushed back from a strong brow without a single curl out of place. He had a square jaw, a Roman nose, and eyes the colour of smoke and winter steel. Everything about him suggested control. Not arrogance, exactly, though it teetered close, but a quiet, unshakable confidence. Like a man who had no need to prove anything, least of all to a crowded ballroom. "And what do we know of Mr. Ashworth?" Eliza asked, tearing her gaze away as she selected a sugared apricot next. Margaret leaned in, eyes wide. "He's from Oxfordshire, a barrister of all things, self-made and clever as sin. They say he turned an entire estate case upside down and left a baron's heir looking like a fool. He's staying with Lord Danforth for the season. No title, no fortune of note. But apparently, he doesn't need them." "I see." Eliza took another sip of lemonade. "And do all of London's daughters plan to marry him for his intellect?" "No," Margaret laughed, "but they might try. They say he never dances, never flirts, and never compliments a lady." "Charming," Eliza said again, dry as salt. And then, as if summoned, the man himself stepped out of a conversation and glanced across the room, meeting her eyes directly. The expression he wore was not one of admiration or even curiosity. It was scrutiny. Cool, composed, evaluating. And Eliza, never one to simper, simply stared back. A moment later, he inclined his head, civil, unsmiling, dismissive, the nerve. Later, near the open doors to the terrace, Eliza turned from the refreshment table and nearly collided with him. "My apologies," he said as he stepped back. "No harm done," she replied, tone cool. "You're Mr. Ashworth, I presume, the barrister with little taste for dancing and even less for conversation." His brow quirked, almost imperceptibly. "We've met before, Miss Harland." "Oh, I remember," she said, lifting her lemonade with deliberate elegance. "You corrected my Latin in front of Lord Witherspoon and a room full of diplomats." "How could I forget?" "Your Latin was incorrect," he said evenly. "I had simply declined to pronounce it like a Roman senator. I was quoting Cicero at a garden party, not delivering an oration in the forum." "You were making a political argument," he countered. "Precision matters." "And yet, you still managed to miss the point entirely." She gave him a small, polite smile. "How very barrister of you." The silence between them shimmered with unspoken words. Eliza took another sip, but her eyes never left his. The memory of that day 3 years ago at Lord Witherspoon's country estate still burned. Not because she had been publicly corrected, though she had, but because she had spent the rest of the afternoon furious that someone so insufferably smug could also be so disturbingly handsome. They had crossed paths again at a literary salon in Bath the following winter. There had been another argument, this time over Mary Wollstonecraft and the education of women. He'd made a sharp, clinical argument that had ruffled every feather in the room, and she'd matched him barb for barb until the host had gently redirected the discussion to poetry. And now, here they were, drawn together once more, as if the universe were determined to throw flint and steel at each other until something caught fire. "You know," she said slowly, "if you keep following me into social engagements, people will begin to talk." "Then let us give them something worth discussing," he replied, offering his arm. "You do still waltz, do you not?" Her lips parted in surprise, but only for a moment. "Only when I feel it won't be a waste of silk." He looked down at her gown, then back up. "Then let us preserve the fabric." She slid her hand into his arm, pulse quickening against her will. "One dance, Mr. Ashworth." "One," he agreed. And yet, as they stepped onto the floor and the orchestra swelled, Neither truly believed it would be the last. End of Chapter 1. Chapter 2. The Waltz. The orchestra lifted into the first notes of a Strauss waltz, and James Ashworth led Eliza Harland onto the polished floor with the same composed assurance he brought to a courtroom. His hand settled lightly at her waist, warm through the silk of her gown, and his other clasped hers in a hold, firm but not possessive. He moved with unhurried precision, as if he were measuring each beat, calculating every turn. It should have felt cold. It did not. Eliza let him guide her into the slow, sweeping rhythm, her spine straight, her chin tilted just enough to suggest amusement rather than submission. They circled once before either of them spoke. James Ashworth was not a man who dazzled on first glance, but he was the kind of man people continued to notice long after the glittering ones had faded from the room. He was tall, broad across the shoulders, but carried himself with a kind of contained stillness that made him seem even taller. His presence was quiet, but not forgettable. He moved with the deliberate control of someone accustomed to being listened to, not because he raised his voice, but because he didn't need to. His features were fine but serious. A strong, clean jaw, a straight nose, and eyes the colour of dark iron, cool at first glance, but sharply perceptive when they turned toward you. His hair was dark brown, cut close, and always slightly tousled at the crown, no matter how recently he'd passed a mirror. He was not handsome in the conventional sense, but there was something about the way he stood, the way he looked at you, as if weighing a truth you hadn't spoken yet, that made it difficult to look away. He dressed plainly, almost severely, always in dark waistcoats and coats cut with exacting precision, his linen immaculate, his boots polished to a low gleam, nothing decorative, nothing indulgent. But somehow the restraint made him more striking. It suited him. A man made of careful choices and quietly kept promises. "You still waltz like a man thinking 2 steps ahead," she murmured. "And you still speak like a woman who wants to be overheard." "Not overheard," she corrected. "Understood. There's a difference." His mouth twitched. A subtle one. She allowed herself a small smile, her eyes glinting. "Subtlety suits you. I've been told bluntness is my greatest failing. No, your greatest failing is arrogance, but bluntness is certainly on the list." He turned them through a precise arc between 2 other couples. "Would you like me to list yours in return?" "Oh, I'm well aware of mine," she said, looking up at him through her lashes. "I simply don't mistake them for virtues." His grey eyes flickered with something unreadable. Admiration, perhaps, or interest, which was far more dangerous. The music swelled. They turned, her skirts whispering around their ankles, the scent of waxed floors and garden roses rising between each breath. He was warm beside her, tall, solid, maddeningly composed. She could feel the subtle tension in his shoulders, like a man used to restraint but rarely intimacy. He danced beautifully, better than she remembered. "You're quiet," she said after a moment. "Has the barbed commentary run out so soon?" "I find I learn more by listening. To me, dangerous habit." "And yet," he said, eyes not leaving hers, "here I am." They turned again, this time near the towering windows that opened to the moonlit garden. For a moment, the candlelight caught the silver embroidery of her gown and made it shimmer like morning frost. James's gaze dropped, not inappropriately, but with something like consideration. "You dress differently than the others." Eliza raised a brow. "I'm not sure if that's an observation or a warning." "It's an observation," he said. "The colour suits you." Now it was her turn to be quiet. She searched his face, expecting irony, but his expression held no mockery. It was a rare thing, she realised, a sincere compliment, offered without fanfare or flirtation. And for a moment, she couldn't quite remember why she disliked him so much. "I didn't expect you to notice clothing," she said lightly, mostly to recover. "I notice everything," he said, "especially when it doesn't follow a pattern." Their steps slowed slightly as the waltz dipped into a more lilting refrain. Eliza turned her head just enough to let a curl fall free near her cheek. His eyes flicked to it before returning to hers. Their faces were closer now. Too close. "Do you always inspect your dance partners this closely, Mr. Ashworth?" "Only when I've argued with them in Latin." That startled a laugh from her. It wasn't loud, but it was genuine. "You've improved since Bath," he added, almost thoughtfully. "At dancing." "At restraint." "And you've grown no softer," she said. "I don't intend to." Their bodies moved in perfect time, the final turn carrying them toward the edge of the floor again. She could feel the weight of other eyes on them, of speculations simmering behind silk fans and raised lorgnettes. But for a few fleeting minutes they were alone in their quiet war, a battle of wit and awareness. As the last note faded, he released her hand with a bow just deep enough to be respectful, though his eyes never left hers. "Miss Harland," he said quietly. "Mr. Ashworth." And then she was gone, slipping into the crowd like a phantom of silk and silver, leaving behind the scent of lemon and something just a touch more dangerous. Curiosity. James watched her disappear, then turned away without a word. But the mark she left, the pull, the puzzle, followed him from the ballroom like a question waiting to be answered. James Ashworth did not believe in coincidence. He believed in timing, in discipline, in the cause and effect of deliberate action. So when he watched Miss Eliza Harland glide away from the dance floor, all silver-threaded silk and narrowed eyes, he didn't curse chance or fate. He cursed himself. It had been a mistake to ask her to dance. He had known it, even as he extended his arm. And yet, there had been something in her voice, in the precise way she wielded her sarcasm like a rapier, that stirred a restlessness in him he had no name for. God help him. He admired her. Still. James moved away from the crowd and stood beside a marble pillar near the card room, loosening his cravat by the barest fraction, an indulgence he would never permit himself in court. He accepted a glass of wine from a passing footman and sipped, though the claret tasted like vinegar after the lemon and sugar still lingering on his tongue. He could feel her there, not in body, but in presence. The echo of her laugh still clung to him, low and unexpected, like a secret shared under candlelight. It had been 3 years since their first encounter at Lord Witherspoon's estate. She'd been a shade younger, slightly less guarded, but no less infuriating. He had meant to correct her gently, discreetly. She had twisted his words in front of a half-dozen men of influence and turned the moment into a duel. One she had nearly won. He'd thought her vain, too clever for her own good, dangerous in the way beautiful women often were when they knew their power. But then came Bath. She had not relied on her beauty there. Not once. She had relied on her mind. And she had challenged him, properly, ruthlessly, intelligently. He had not forgotten the way her voice had cut through the salon, the way she met his logic with passion and precision. That night had stayed with him longer than he liked to admit. And now here she was, more composed than ever, more stunning than he remembered. Which was annoying, frankly. Most people disappointed upon second meeting, Miss Harland did not. She had only grown sharper, more polished, and more practiced in the art of dismissal. But he had also caught something else in her tonight, a flicker beneath the control, a hunger for something deeper than flirtation. He set the wine aside untouched and folded his hands behind his back. He should keep his distance. She was the daughter of a viscount, well-connected, sought after. And he was merely the son of a solicitor from Oxfordshire, tolerated among the upper crust only because of his skill and his association with Danforth. Marriage was not his game. Affection had never been a safe one either. Still, when she had smiled, not coyly, but like a general with the upper hand, it had pulled at something he had not felt in years. Something unfamiliar, something warm. He didn't want to like her. He wanted to outthink her, outmaneuver her, make her see him as something other than the stiff, rule-bound man she clearly thought him to be. But as he watched the crowd absorb her once more, her silver gown trailing like moonlight through candlelight, James knew one thing for certain. He would dance with her again. Not because of the way she looked, though she was breathtaking. Not because of the way she spoke, though she challenged him like no one else. But because when he danced with Eliza Harland, he stopped thinking about everything else. And for a man like James Ashworth, that was no small thing. End of Chapter 2. Chapter 3. Harland House, Mayfair, just past midnight. By the time the Harland carriage turned onto Brook Street, Eliza had already begun to unfasten the long row of pearl buttons at her wrists. The night had gone as expected, save for one dance that had lingered far too long in her mind. She sank back against the cushions and stared out at the slick cobblestones, faintly gleaming under a half-moon. London after midnight was a quieter thing, stripped of its social varnish, smelling faintly of chimney smoke and damp stone. The house loomed ahead, elegant but not ostentatious, its pale limestone facade softened by ivy and the faint golden glow spilling from the lower windows. Harland House was a gentleman's townhouse, tastefully appointed, fiercely private, and built for comfort rather than display. Her father's doing. As the footman opened the carriage door, Eliza gathered the folds of her gown and stepped down carefully, her satin slippers brushing against the edge of the step. Even after several hours, the weight of the silver embroidery dragged slightly on her hem, but it had been worth it. The gown was new, a gift from her father, though she had selected the design herself. A frost blue silk charmeuse lined in dove grey, with crystal beading at the sleeves, and a low, squared neckline edged in gauze. Simple by the ton's standards, but the effect was striking. Once inside, she dismissed the maid with a quiet nod and made her way through the dim corridors to the breakfast room where a single candle flickered on the sideboard beside a silver tray. As expected, her father had left her a note in his firm, elegant hand. "You looked very much your mother tonight. There's warm bread in the covered dish. Sleep well. Father." Eliza smiled and set the note aside. The bread was indeed warm. Seeded oat rolls with a soft crust, wrapped in linen to keep in the heat. Beside them was a dish of soft butter, a small jar of golden plum preserves, and a glass of spiced milk left, covered with a silver lid. She sat at the little mahogany table near the hearth and pulled one of the rolls apart slowly, letting the fragrant steam rise. The preserve was tart and sweet, made by their cook just last week, from fruit brought in from Sussex. She spread it thickly on the warm bread and took a slow, thoughtful bite. It grounded her. Bread, butter, quiet, all solid things in a night that had felt strangely uncertain. James Ashworth. She hadn't expected to think of him, let alone dance with him, and certainly not to enjoy it. There had always been something maddening about him, his stillness, his precision, that infuriating calm that made it impossible to know what he was truly thinking. She had once likened him to a locked door, polished, impenetrable, and too proud to admit he might be hiding something behind it. And yet, tonight, he had complimented her gown, and he had meant it. That alone had knocked her slightly off balance. Worse, he hadn't tried to impress her. He hadn't even smiled unless she provoked him, which she had repeatedly against her better judgment. Her fingers trailed idly along the rim of the glass. She couldn't decide whether she wanted to outwit him, unravel him, or never see him again. But she would see him again. That much was certain. Their circles were too neatly overlapped now, thanks to Lord Danforth's inexplicable fondness for him. It wasn't ideal, but it was something she could manage. She always managed. Rising from the table, Eliza took one last bite of bread before heading upstairs to her bedchamber, where the fire had already been laid and her nightgown set out. Soft cotton lawn with pale blue ribbon at the neckline. Simple and familiar. Her maid returned to help her out of her gown, carefully removing the beaded sleeves and brushing out her hair, which fell in loose waves past her shoulders. It still held the faint scent of the rose oil used in her bath. "Leave the fire," Eliza murmured. "Yes, miss," the maid whispered, and slipped away. Alone now, Eliza sat before the mirror in her dressing gown, brushing her hair slowly. She studied her own reflection, not as the Tun would see her, not as Ashworth had seen her, but as she truly was, the eyes too serious, the mouth that revealed too much, the face that looked more and more like her mother's each year. She set the brush down and blew out the final candle, leaving the room in the soft flicker of firelight. Tomorrow would come, and with it, more conversation, more masks, more glances passed across crowded rooms. But tonight, she let herself remember the weight of his hand at her waist, the warmth of his voice close to her ear, and the strange ache of wanting to ask him one more question. Not to argue, just to hear what he would say. End of chapter 3. Chapter 4. Danforth House, Grosvenor Square, same night. James Ashworth returned to Danforth House just after midnight, the night's chill clinging to the collar of his coat as the front door opened soundlessly to receive him. The household was already dimmed for the evening, but still alert. A silent efficiency that came with old money and a well-trained staff. A single lantern burned in the entryway, casting long shadows across the marble floor and the framed ancestral portraits lining the walls. He shrugged off his coat and handed it, along with his gloves, to the footman without a word. His polished shoes echoed faintly on the tile as he made his way down the west corridor, bypassing the grand staircase and the empty drawing room. He didn't need light to navigate. He had lived here long enough to know every turn. Lord Danforth had insisted James stay at the townhouse for the season. "You'll need an address in Mayfair, and I have no use for 5 bedrooms when only 2 are occupied." James had refused at first, as he often did when Danforth offered too much too easily. But practicality had won. The arrangement made sense. Danforth's name opened doors, and living in Grosvenor Square afforded James a proximity to influence that even his courtroom victories could not yet guarantee. Still, Danforth House wasn't home. The ceilings were too high, the carpets too thick. Every piece of furniture had history embedded in the grain, but none of it was his. He was a guest here, welcomed, yes, but never belonging. He entered the library without lighting a lamp. A fire had already been laid, the faint glow of coals casting the room in soft orange and shadow. He moved to the hearth, one hand braced against the mantel, and exhaled a long breath through his nose. The ball, held at Lady Whitcomb's estate, had been like any other: candlelight, waltzes, chatter. But the moment Eliza Harland stepped onto the floor, everything else had blurred into the edges. He had danced with her. He had held her waist, felt the weight of her gaze, the precise, practiced sharpness of her words. It should have been familiar. They had argued before. They had locked horns over politics, over philosophy, over Latin syntax, for God's sake. But tonight had not been an argument. Not exactly. It had felt like alignment, the kind that unnerves more than it reassures. He poured a small glass of brandy and sat in one of the leather chairs near the fire. His cravat was still neatly tied, though it felt suddenly too tight. He tugged it loose and leaned back, staring into the flames. Eliza Harland. Even her name felt like a challenge. There was nothing soft about her. Not in her expression, her bearing, her voice. And yet, she carried softness within her. He had seen it flicker once during their dance, just for a second, when she'd smiled, not with triumph, but with amusement, with warmth. It had rattled him more than her insults ever had. He took a sip of brandy and closed his eyes. He had spent most of his life building control, restraint. He didn't gamble. He didn't chase women. He didn't indulge in flattery or flirtation, and he certainly didn't allow himself to be distracted. But tonight, he had danced with Eliza Harland, and for 5 minutes and 24 measured bars of music, he had forgotten every rule he lived by. He set the glass down without finishing it and crossed to the far end of the room where the heavy walnut desk stood near the window. Inside the top drawer was a letter from his sister, cheerful, warm, irritatingly perceptive. "You've been in London for weeks and still haven't written anything useful. Please tell me you've done more than reorganize someone else's law books. Even you, dearest brother, must occasionally live." He let the letter fall shut and reached for a blank sheet of paper. The candle's flame swayed slightly in the breeze as he dipped his pen into the ink. But he didn't write. He sat there, the pen resting in his hand, the blank page open before him, and realized he didn't know how to begin. He could write to her, of course. But what would he say? That she had been the most arresting woman in the room. That she had challenged him without effort. That he hadn't been able to sleep since their last argument in Bath, though he had told himself, convincingly, that it had nothing to do with her. No, he would not say any of that. Instead, he imagined her again. Not the sharp lines of her wit or the tight coil of her retorts, but the way she had paused before taking his arm, the flicker of indecision. The fact that she had danced with him at all. It meant something. And that, more than anything, was what kept him awake. He folded the blank sheet, slid it back into the drawer, and doused the candle. He would not write to her tonight. But if she danced with him again, and he hoped she would not hold back. Not this time. End of chapter 4. Chapter 5. Harland House. The next morning. Eliza woke to the soft creak of her maid drawing back the curtains. Pale sunlight spilled across the room, golden and cool, casting long lines over the damask coverlet and embroidered pillows. "Good morning, miss," the maid said softly. "Your father's gone out riding, but he asked me to remind you that Lady Chelmsford is expected for tea this afternoon." Eliza groaned and pulled the coverlet over her head. "If she arrives early, you are to claim I've been taken ill. Or taken hostage." Her maid laughed in the gentle, long-suffering way she always did when Eliza made threats she didn't mean. "Will you be dressing before breakfast, miss?" Eliza emerged reluctantly, her hair a tangle and her mood unsettled. "Yes. I suppose we must maintain some illusion of respectability." While the bath was drawn and her gown laid out, Eliza moved to the window and opened it just enough to feel the autumn breeze. It carried the scent of horse-chestnut and chimney smoke, and beneath it all, the faintest trace of London's ever-present coal and ambition. She couldn't stop thinking about last night. She hadn't meant to. Had, in fact, intended to wake up determined to forget James Ashworth entirely. But sleep had not wiped the memory of his voice from her mind. It lingered, low and measured, like a question waiting for an answer. After a bath perfumed lightly with lavender oil and a long hour spent brushing out her hair, Eliza dressed in a soft morning gown of cream muslin with a high ruffled collar, the hem embroidered with pale blue cornflowers. Her hair was left in a loose twist, secured with a silver comb shaped like a swallow in flight. It was not a gown meant to impress, but it suited her mood, comfortable, quiet, and contemplative. She descended to the breakfast room to find it already laid with a fine linen cloth, polished silver, and her father's morning paper folded beside a plate of half-eaten toast. Her own place was arranged with a selection of soft-boiled eggs, poached pears in honeyed wine, warm currant buns with a golden crust, and a small pot of apricot preserves. Eliza sat, poured herself tea from the silver pot, and reached for a bun, tearing it open to spread a generous spoonful of preserve inside. The scent of citrus and sugar filled the air, warming her hands as she held the bun to her mouth. The food helped. Food always did. There was something reliable in the simplicity of bread and fruit and hot tea, a ritual that grounded her even when her thoughts wandered far afield. Like they were now. She pressed the edge of her teacup to her lips and closed her eyes. Why did I agree to dance with him? It wasn't the first time they'd clashed. Their past encounters had always been barbed, charged, layered with subtle antagonism. But last night had been different. There had been tension, yes, but also something else. Something under the surface. Not flirtation exactly, but an awareness. A dangerous awareness. She had never allowed herself to consider Mr. Ashworth seriously. Clever, yes. Composed. Too composed, if she was honest. But he did not belong to her world. That mattered. She hated that it did, but it was truth, nonetheless. The butler entered just then, with a salver. "A letter for you, Miss Harland." She blinked. At this hour. He handed it to her without comment. The paper was thick, cream-coloured, sealed in dark green wax. No crest, but the handwriting was unmistakable. Ashworth. The Eliza's stomach tightened with something uncomfortably close to anticipation. She turned the letter over in her hands, weighing whether to open it immediately or wait until the privacy of her room. Curiosity won. She broke the seal with a flick of her fingernail and unfolded the single sheet. "Miss Harland, I am aware our last conversation ended without resolution. You might be relieved to know that I have no intention of debating Cicero or Wollstonecraft in writing. Instead, I find myself, inexplicably, hoping for the chance to speak again without interruption. Should you find yourself in the company of dull conversation or poor weather in the coming days, I would consider it a privilege to provide distraction, if not improvement. Respectfully, James Ashworth." Eliza stared at the words. No flattery, no poetry. Just plain, honest expression, exactly like him. She folded the letter again with slow, deliberate care, then laid it face down on the linen beside her teacup. She took another bite of the currant bun and chewed it slowly, thoughtfully. "More tea, miss?" her maid asked gently, returning with a fresh pot of tea. Eliza gave a faint smile, more to herself than anyone else. "Tell my father I'll be taking the curricle out this morning. I shall call on Lady Danforth." End of Chapter 5. Chapter 6. Danforth House, Grosvenor Square, late morning. The curricle rolled to a smooth stop in front of Danforth House just before 11, the sun gleaming off its freshly polished lamps. Eliza sat with perfect posture, her gloved hands loose on the reins, her eyes fixed ahead, as if she hadn't spent half the ride rehearsing all the ways she might greet Mr. Ashworth, and all the ways she might pretend not to care after their dance at the Whitcombes. She wore a walking dress of soft sage green, cut with elegant simplicity, and a Spencer jacket in darker velvet, the high collar framed in ivory braid. Her gloves were cream kid, her half boots laced with ribbons to match. At her throat was a small gold pin shaped like a thistle, an old gift from her father, one she wore when she wanted to feel brave. A footman stepped forward as she dismounted, and within moments, the great black lacquered door of Danforth House swung open. "Miss Harland," the butler intoned, bowing, "you are most welcome." Eliza offered a gracious nod, the perfect image of a visiting lady with nothing on her mind but a polite morning call. She stepped into the entrance hall, where light poured through the fan-shaped transom above the door and glinted off the polished parquet floor. The house smelled of beeswax, old leather, and the faintest trace of violets. "Lady Danforth is in the east drawing-room," the butler said, already gesturing to a maid to take Eliza's pelisse and gloves. "Mr. Ashworth is also at home." "Is he?" Eliza asked, smoothly neutral. "He is in the library." "I see." She glanced down the hallway, heart giving a treacherous little jump. Perhaps he will remain there. But of course, he did not. As she entered the drawing-room, all pale silk walls and watercolour landscapes, she found Lady Danforth reclining on a damask chaise, her small terrier curled beside her and a plate of lemon biscuits within easy reach. "Eliza, my dear," the older woman cried, sitting up with delight. "I told your father I hoped you'd call before the week's end." "I couldn't resist the thought of your lemon biscuits," Eliza said, smiling as she sank gracefully into a nearby chair. Lady Danforth beamed. "You must stay for tea. I have a new variety. Spiced orange with a hint of clove. Quite bold, but I rather like it." Eliza sipped the tea when it arrived and found it surprisingly good, warm and a little wild, much like the woman who poured it. They spoke for a time about the season, mutual acquaintances, and Lady Chelmsford's unfortunate habit of interrupting herself mid-sentence. And then, predictably, the door opened. James stepped inside without fanfare, his coat exchanged for a simple dark waistcoat and crisp shirt, sleeves rolled back just enough to reveal strong forearms and immaculate cuffs. His hair was still damp from what she assumed had been a morning ride. He looked completely at ease, though not, she noticed, entirely surprised to see her. "Miss Harland," he said, bowing with careful civility. "Mr. Ashworth." He didn't linger by the door, nor did he cross the room to sit. He simply stood, hands clasped behind his back, like a man listening carefully to the terms of an agreement. "I've just been admiring your hostess's daring taste in tea," Eliza said, lifting her cup. "Spiced orange, quite unconventional." "Much like Lady Danforth herself," James said. The older woman chuckled. "Oh, come now. You've grown nearly as stiff as your letters, James. Sit. Join us. I believe Miss Harland may be the only person in London who doesn't shrink under your glare." "I'm certain Miss Harland is impervious to a great many things," he said, meeting Eliza's gaze. "Not your judgment. I assure you, she replied, dry as toast. That earned her a look, unreadable but not unamused. Lady Danforth rose, brushing crumbs from her skirts. I'll fetch the second pot myself. You know how the footmen steep it too long. I'll leave you both to your polite sparring. And just like that, they were alone. The silence hummed. Not uncomfortable, but weighted. James moved to stand beside the hearth, resting one arm on the marble mantel. You received my letter. I did. You didn't respond. I wasn't certain it required a reply. It did not, he said evenly. But I was curious. About my silence? About your presence. His gaze sharpened slightly. This isn't a social call. Not truly. Eliza's lips curved. No, it isn't. A beat passed between them. I came, she said at last, because I wanted to know whether the man who wrote that letter was the same man I danced with, or the one who corrected my Latin, or the one who argued with me in Bath. I've not quite decided which one is real. And what have you concluded? I haven't. She tilted her head slightly. You're difficult to read. And you, he said, stepping closer, are impossible to ignore. Eliza's pulse jumped. She hoped to God it didn't show. She placed her teacup down, very carefully, and rose to her feet. They stood now nearly level, neither smiling, neither flinching. Why now? She asked. Why that letter? James was silent for a moment. Then, because I am tired of pretending indifference when I feel none. The words struck her like a breeze across bare skin. Subtle, unexpected, thrilling. I don't know what you expect me to say, she said quietly. I don't expect anything, he replied. But I've found, Miss Harland, that clarity, even unwelcome clarity, is preferable to silence. Clarity. That word again. He wielded it like a blade, not to wound, but to cut through every layer she kept between herself and want. I have no clarity to offer you, she said. Only conversation. Perhaps more dances. Nothing more. He held her gaze. For now. She blinked. I didn't say that. You didn't have to. A rustle of skirts announced Lady Danforth's return, and whatever had existed in the silence between them dissolved like breath on glass. Well, the lady said, sweeping back in with the teapot, you two look remarkably well behaved. Should I be suspicious? Only mildly, Eliza murmured. James smiled, just barely, and turned back to the hearth. Eliza took up her cup once more, but her fingers trembled just slightly against the porcelain. End of chapter 6. Chapter 7. Brook Street, late morning. The city was brighter when Eliza stepped out of Danforth House than it had been when she arrived, the kind of sharp autumn light that made every rooftop look a shade paler and every passing carriage more vivid. The air carried the scent of coal smoke and the faint tang of crushed leaves underfoot. Crisp and clear, like the first clean breath after an illness. Her groom brought the curricle round within moments. She took the reins herself, lifting her chin slightly in that way she always did when she needed to feel in control. She didn't feel in control. Not entirely. Not with the weight of James Ashworth's voice still echoing in her mind. Because I am tired of pretending indifference when I feel none. She had not expected that, nor the look in his eyes when he said it. Calm, yes, but with something behind it. Something careful and waiting. She drove in silence for some time, the steady clatter of the horses' hooves giving her space to think. The streets of Mayfair blurred around her well-dressed matrons outside milliners' shops, footmen lifting silver-domed trays into carriages, the scent of roasted chestnuts curling from a cart on the corner. A passing delivery boy hurried past, arms full of wrapped loaves still warm from the oven. She felt hunger stir at the edge of her thoughts, not for food exactly, but for something solid, something grounding. A familiar comfort her mother had always believed a well-set table could soothe most things. A piece of bread, a dish of something warm, not to indulge, but to steady. And she could have used steadiness now. She turned onto Brook Street, letting the reins slacken slightly as they neared Harland House. The familiar sight of its limestone facade and bay windows didn't settle her as it usually did. She wasn't ready to go inside. She pulled the horse to a stop beneath a row of tall maples, the leaves curling gold and copper above her like cathedral arches. The breeze tugged at the plume of her hat, lifting strands of hair from her temples. Her gloves were warm now, her fingers flexing inside them as if trying to shape a thought too large to hold. What did he want? He hadn't said affection. He hadn't said admiration. He hadn't said anything romantic at all. And yet somehow, the absence of flattery had made his words feel heavier. James Ashworth was not a man who gave things lightly. Not praise, not kindness, and certainly not attention. And yet he had offered her his honesty, carefully worded, yes, but real. She looked down at her hands, curled around the reins, the kid leather creased with the shape of her grip. He had said he felt something. She hadn't asked him what. She hadn't dared. And yet part of her wanted to know. Not out of vanity, but out of need. Because if it was what she feared, or hoped, then everything might change. And she had spent too long building herself into someone who didn't bend. A soft knock on the side of the curricle jolted her from her thoughts. Her groom stood waiting, ever patient, his expression carefully neutral. "Home, miss." Eliza nodded, her voice catching before it emerged. Yes. Home. As the curricle eased forward again, the familiar lines of Brook Street passing slowly by, she let out a long breath and rested her gloved hands on her lap. She would not write to him. She would not dwell on his words. She would not dream of the way he had looked at her across that gilded drawing room, as though he saw straight through the lace and the wit and the carefully maintained poise. She would not. And yet, she knew. As surely as she knew the warmth of a shared table or the sound of her own laughter when she forgot to guard it, that this was not over. She had not responded to his letter. But she had gone to him. And that was the first step down a path she could not unwalk, no matter how carefully she tried to pretend it hadn't begun. End of Chapter 7. Chapter 8. Harland House. That evening. The fire in the drawing room had burned low, its embers casting a soft amber glow across the hearth rug. Eliza sat alone in her favourite chair, tucked sideways with her slippered feet drawn up beneath her and a light shawl draped around her shoulders. The lace edge of it curled against her arm like ivy. Her evening gown, a soft, plum-coloured silk with narrow sleeves and a gathered bodice, had grown warm in the glow of the hearth, and her hair, now loosely pinned, had begun to fall in curls near her temples. She didn't move to fix it. The day had frayed something in her, and for once, she allowed it to remain unpolished. On the small writing table beside her sat a cup of lukewarm tea, forgotten, and a folded sheet of paper that had not yet found its purpose. She picked up the pen, dipped it, and stared at the page. "I have not decided whether you are dangerous or simply inconvenient. Perhaps both. It would explain the way you unsettle me without ever raising your voice. The ink shimmered wetly. She let it dry, then folded the page once, not sealed, not addressed, and slipped it into the drawer beside her. One of many letters she would never send. She leaned her head back against the chair and closed her eyes. She had not expected James to say what he did. She hadn't expected the steadiness of it, the weight. She had not expected to care. The quiet creak of the door made her eyes open. Her father stepped in, carrying a glass of port and a small plate. He was still in his dinner coat, but had loosened the cravat at his throat and looked far more himself, without the weight of conversation pressing down on him. "I told Mrs. Hall not to send anything up," he said. She responded with pear tart. Eliza gave a soft smile. "She's a tyrant, a well-meaning one. Much like you." He set the plate down beside her, then lowered himself into the chair opposite with a grunt and a sigh. "You've been quiet today." "Have I?" He gave her a look over the rim of his glass. "Suspiciously so." Eliza let the silence sit a moment before answering. "Do you believe a person can be difficult and still worth knowing?" He gave a short laugh. "You're describing every friend I've ever kept." She looked at him then, more carefully. "I mean someone who challenges you, not for sport, not to provoke, but because they see the parts of you that don't fall in line." He nodded slowly, setting the glass aside. "The best people do. They make you sharper, or softer, or more honest, whether you want them to or not. I think I met one of those people." His brow lifted, but he didn't press. He only sat forward slightly, elbows on his knees, watching her as he had when she was young and frightened of things she didn't have names for. "You don't have to explain," he said gently. "Only know this. You are under no obligation to remain unchanged." Her throat tightened. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed to hear that. "Pear tart," he offered, as if the weight of the moment hadn't just shifted. She took the fork he handed her, cut a neat corner from the crust, and tasted it. Still warm. Fragrant with cinnamon, and just sweet enough to remind her that the world still held comfort, even when it confused her. They ate in companionable quiet. No more questions. No more confessions. But when her father rose and kissed the top of her head, she closed her eyes for a moment longer than necessary, as if anchoring herself to something safe before the tide could pull her further out. End of Chapter 8. Chapter 9. Danforth House, midnight. James had not gone out that evening. He'd been expected at a dinner, one of those dreary political affairs Lord Danforth considered essential. But he had begged off with a vague excuse and a tight smile. Danforth had raised an eyebrow, but said nothing. Now the house was quiet. The kind of stillness that only arrived deep into the night when the servants slept and even the clock seemed reluctant to chime. He sat at his usual chair in the library, a half-drunk glass of brandy warming slowly in his hand, the room lit only by the fire and one shaded lamp. She had come to him. She had come without invitation, without chaperone, without pretending it was for Lady Danforth's sake, though she had spoken with grace and poise, and he knew better than to believe it meant nothing. He had known her long enough to recognize the effort it took for her to remain still when she wanted to run. And still, she had stayed. He closed his eyes for a moment and exhaled slowly, letting his head fall back against the chair. His cravat was gone, his shirt collar loosened, the cuffs of his sleeves undone. A book lay face down on the table beside him, unread. He hadn't touched a page since she left. Every word she had spoken echoed with deliberation. She had measured her phrases the way a fencer chose a blade. but her eyes had given her away, and her hands. He remembered the way she'd set down her teacup, carefully, too carefully, as if steadying herself for something. And he had wanted to reach across the space between them and ask her, without words, "What are you afraid of?" But he hadn't, because he feared the answer. His whole life had been carved from discipline. He had mastered courts, commissions, and committees. He had faced down elder statesmen and arrogant young heirs with equal skill. But Eliza Harland unsettled him in ways he couldn't reason through. He stood, restless, and moved toward the fire. The library always soothed him, its symmetry, its quiet. But tonight, it felt like a room waiting for something to happen, or someone to return. He looked down at the flames, their low crackle filling the silence. She had said he was difficult to read. That was intentional. She had said she hadn't decided who he was. Neither had he. He thought of her now, in her green riding dress and velvet spencer, her gaze cool, but not cold. She had not flirted. She had not blushed. She had not pretended. She had simply been. And he had seen her, not the polished daughter of a respected household, not the brilliant wit he'd once dismissed too quickly, but a woman who had grown tired of being mistaken. And he had wanted her to see him too, past the ambition, past the logic, past the silence he kept so tightly around his own uncertainty. He reached for a letter from the edge of the desk. Not hers. One from a former colleague requesting his opinion on a new parliamentary proposal. He glanced at it, then folded it again, untouched. He would answer it tomorrow. Tonight, his thoughts were elsewhere. And though he would never admit it aloud, not to Danforth, not to his sister, and certainly not to himself, he found that he was hoping. Not for romance, not for declarations, but for another moment like this morning, quiet, charged, filled with the possibility that something might shift if he reached a little further. Just once. End of chapter 9. Chapter 10. Harland House, 3 days later. It had taken 3 days for the gossip to reach her. Not long enough for it to fade, but just enough for it to settle into parlours and drawing rooms with the kind of oily confidence that made denial seem suspicious. The whispers were soft, but persistent. Names paired where none had been. Intentions assigned where none had been declared. Eliza was just finishing breakfast when Margaret arrived, unannounced, breathless, and brimming with purpose. Her cheeks were flushed from the walk, and her bonnet sat slightly askew over her dark curls, as if it had been tied in haste. Margaret Halford was her cousin on her mother's side, a year older, infinitely more practical, and in possession of a sort of unshakable self-assurance Eliza had always admired. They had grown up together, shared governesses and secrets and summers by the sea. Now, though Margaret had long since stepped away from the crush of the season, she moved through its quieter currents with frightening accuracy. "Eliza!" she called from the entry, not waiting to be announced. "Where are you? It cannot wait." Eliza turned in her chair just as Margaret swept into the morning room, already pulling off her gloves with unnecessary drama. "Good heavens," Eliza said, raising one brow. "Has someone died?" "Worse." Margaret dropped into the nearest chair and tugged her bonnet free. "Someone has spoken." That does tend to happen in society. Don't be flippant. It's about him. You'll need to be more specific. There are quite a few hymns in London. James Ashworth. Eliza's hand paused over the butter knife. Ah, that hymn. The breakfast table was still attractively laid. Linen crisp, silver polished to a high gleam, the scent of orange pekoe rising warmly from a delicate porcelain pot. Before her sat a soft-boiled egg in its silver cup, one half-eaten slice of ham with a glaze of mustard, and a small plate of currant buns still warm from the kitchen. One had already been split, its interior steaming faintly, and generously spread with apricot preserve that clung in amber streaks to her knife. A dish of poached pears rested nearby, steeped in cinnamon and clove, and a silver-rimmed bowl held raspberries scattered with sugar. It was a proper breakfast, not extravagant, but carefully chosen, comforting, seasonal, and quietly luxurious. And now she could hardly taste it. Margaret leaned in, lowering her voice as if the marmalade might report them. Someone saw you leaving Danforth house earlier this week. Alone. Late in the morning. And now it's being said that you called not on Lady Danforth, but on him. Eliza took a sip of tea and said calmly, I called on Lady Danforth. Mr. Ashworth happened to be present. Well, no one cares about that. It's the image, Eliza. A young lady seen departing his residence unattended, and then vanishing from society for 3 days. Of course they're talking. Vanishing, Eliza echoed. I've attended 2 luncheons and a hospital committee meeting. Yes, but none of them were interesting. Eliza set her cup down and folded her hands neatly. She wore a pale, lilac morning gown patterned with white sprigs, the sleeves gathered at the elbows with narrow satin ribbon. Her hair, still faintly damp from her earlier bath, had been pinned in a low twist, secured with a single pearl comb. Slippers of lavender velvet peeked from beneath her hem, the sort one wore when not expecting drama. She had dressed for a quiet morning. Gossip, evidently, had not. Margaret, in her usual slate-blue walking dress and a too heavy wool pelisse, looked wind-blown and triumphant. They're saying, Margaret continued, that there is an understanding. Eliza choked slightly on her tea. Margaret passed her a napkin with practised calm. Forgive me. I should have led with the more romantic version, that the 2 of you are secretly engaged and merely waiting for the appropriate window to announce it. That's absurd. That's society. Eliza glanced down at her currant bun. Its golden crust had begun to cool. She pushed it aside. Who's repeating it? I heard it from Cecily Langford, Margaret said, which means it's already circled half of London. And if she is saying it aloud, you can be sure others are saying worse behind their fans. Eliza's jaw clenched. Not at the idea of gossip, that was inevitable, but at how quickly one moment, one look, had been turned into a promise. And yet, Margaret added softly, they're not wrong about one thing. Eliza glanced up. Which is? You don't look at him the way you look at anyone else. Eliza gave her a flat, warning look. Is that a compliment or a threat? A bit of both. Outside, the city clattered on. Cartwheels, hooves, the distant cry of a street vendor. Inside, the silver gleamed and the air hung heavy with the scent of tea, warm bread, and something harder to name. She had not kissed James Ashworth. She had not touched him. But now her name was being stitched to his like a lining. Quiet, presumed, inevitable. I suppose the real question, Margaret said gently, is whether you mind. Eliza didn't answer at first. She lifted her cup again, holding it with both hands, anchoring herself to the familiar. Her gloves lay untouched. Her breakfast had gone cold. I should mind, she said finally. But, Margaret pressed, but I don't. Margaret tilted her head, watching her closely. The Eliza's voice was quieter now, as if speaking it aloud gave it shape. I think I'm trying very hard not to. End of Chapter 10. Chapter 11. Danforth House. Afternoon. James had just returned from the chambers at Westminster when he heard his name spoken in the hallway. He paused just inside the entrance to the drawing room, listening without meaning to, coat still unbuttoned, gloves in hand. Ashworth and Miss Harland, a woman's voice said lightly, teasingly, though of course it hasn't been officially announced. No, but you know how it is, came the reply. She was seen leaving here not long ago, and not in a hurry, mind you, entirely too composed for a casual call. A breathless little laugh followed. James stepped forward, making just enough noise to be heard. The two ladies, guests of Lady Danforth's Tuesday circle, turned at once. One flushed, the other, to her credit, held his gaze with no sign of embarrassment. He bowed slightly. Ladies. There was a murmur of polite greetings and quick excuses. They gathered their shawls and retreated to the music room, leaving the air thick with something unspoken. James crossed to the hearth, tugging off his gloves with more force than necessary. He hadn't intended to stay long. He had only stopped by to collect a report he'd left in the study. But now he could not leave. He stood still for a moment, staring at the fire, its orange-gold light flickering low. He had expected resistance to his presence in society. Danforth had warned him when the appointment came, but he had not anticipated this kind of scrutiny. He had not anticipated Eliza becoming part of it. "Do you want to know what they're saying?" came a voice behind him. Unmistakably Lord Danforth's, dry and amused. James didn't turn. "I believe I've just heard a portion of it." Danforth came to stand beside him, hands clasped behind his back, rocking slightly on his heels. "You'll be relieved to know they aren't accusing you of impropriety, just of being unusually compelling." James gave a short laugh. "I find that highly unlikely." "Well, I agree. But Eliza Harland isn't known for foolish attachments. The moment she appears in a room with any man more than once, people take notice. She was here to see your wife." "And you happened to be there. And now there are whispers. You know how it works." James looked at him sidelong. "Is this a warning?" Danforth lifted a brow. "Should it be?" James didn't answer. Instead, he unbuttoned the last of his coat and tossed it over the back of the chair. Danforth continued, voice more thoughtful now. "You're not the sort of man who draws attention without meaning to. But Eliza is watched, always. Not for scandal. She's never invited it. But because people want to understand her. And they can't." That landed. James said nothing. "You care what they think?" Danforth asked, studying him. "I care what she thinks." Danforth nodded once, as if he had expected the answer. "Then it's simple." "It's never simple." "It is, in this case." His voice was dry again. "If you mean nothing by it, stop looking at her like you do." James's jaw tightened. "And if I do mean something by it?" But he didn't say that. Instead he said, "Does she know?" "About the gossip? Of course. It's been 3 days. She likely knew before you did. But knowing Eliza, she's already tucked the whole matter into a silk-lined box in her mind and labelled it irrelevant." James glanced toward the window. The sky beyond it was grey, low and cold-looking. "It's not irrelevant to me." There was a pause. Danforth, at last, gave a quiet huff of breath. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. "Then I suppose the question is what you intend to do about it." James didn't answer right away, because for the first time in a very long time, he didn't know. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. Harland House. Evening. The lamp on her writing desk flickered as a breeze found its way through the shutters. Eliza didn't move to close them. She sat with her back straight, her hands resting lightly on a sheet of untouched paper, and stared at the blank space, as though it had personally offended her. 3 letters lay to the side. One from her aunt in Surrey, one from a charity secretary requesting her attendance at a planning meeting, and one from Lady Chelmsford written in her usual looping scrawl, gently implying that Eliza had been a touch absent of late. Not one of them mentioned James Ashworth, but he was everywhere between the lines. She rose abruptly from the desk and crossed to the hearth, tugging the silk sash tighter at her waist. Her evening gown was soft ivory, the sleeves loose and gathered at the wrist. It was meant for comfort, not display. But the fabric whispered when she moved, and she felt too aware of herself in it. Too aware of her own skin, of the heat in the room, of the warmth that had settled behind her ribs and refused to leave. She had not seen him since that morning at Danforth House. She had not written. He had not written either. But people had spoken. And listened. And now her name belonged to a story she had not chosen. One she had no control over, except to reject it. And she wasn't sure she wanted to. She crossed to the window instead, drew back the curtain, and looked out over the street. Brook Street was quiet at this hour, the flicker of carriage lamps in the distance, the occasional lantern swinging as a footman passed. She pressed her fingertips to the window glass. What she felt wasn't infatuation. It wasn't a girlish crush, nor a poetic yearning. It was quieter, more dangerous. A kind of recognition. The sense that he saw her clearly, and worse, that she wanted to be seen. The thought startled her. She stepped away from the window and returned to her desk. After a moment's hesitation, she reached for the pen. She didn't write his name. Not at first. She simply began. There is a difference between being looked at and being understood. I have endured the former most of my life. The latter, I find, is far more dangerous. She paused. Read the line once, then twice. She dipped the pen again. Do you always speak so plainly? Or only when you know the silence will cost you more than the answer? She set the pen down. There. Not a letter. Not yet. Just words. Just a moment of honesty in a room where no one could hear her. But even so, it felt like a step. A small one. Deliberate. She folded the page carefully and placed it in her drawer beside the others, all addressed, none sent. Then she rose, untied her sash, and let the gown fall away from her shoulders in silence. She didn't need to see him. Not tonight. But she had admitted something. And once admitted, it could not be taken back. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13. Lady Chelmsford's Autumn Assembly, Hanover Square. Eliza knew before she arrived that he would be there. It wasn't a certainty, not quite, but an instinct. A prickle of awareness beneath her skin, the kind that made her adjust the ribbon on her gloves twice and change her earrings at the last moment. She had never dressed for James Ashworth before. She wasn't dressing for him now. But she was no longer dressing as though he didn't matter. The assembly was held in the grand upstairs ballroom of the Chelmsford townhouse, a cavernous space draped in autumn silks, lanterns glowing gold against polished mirrors, and a quartet stationed discreetly in the gallery. It was one of the few events that could draw both the fashionable set and the older political families, a mingling of gowns and ambition in equal measure. Eliza wore a gown of deep sapphire blue, high-waisted and simply cut, but edged with fine silver embroidery at the cuffs and hem. Her hair had been twisted into a low knot, pinned with mother-of-pearl combs shaped like trailing ivy. She had chosen no necklace, no gloves with embellishments. The simplicity made the fabric look richer. It made her look unapproachable, which had been precisely the point. She was tired of being read like an open page. Lady Chelmsford received her with a delighted exclamation and the obligatory kiss to each cheek. "My dear," she said loudly enough for nearby ears. "You mustn't hide yourself away again. I won't allow it. Rumours must be faced head-on, not avoided." Eliza smiled. "If I avoided every rumour, I'd never leave the house." "That's the spirit." Lady Chelmsford patted her hand. "Now go dazzle someone important." Eliza slipped into the crowd without comment. The room was too warm, too full. The scent of candle wax and too many different perfumes settled over everything. She moved through it like smoke, exchanging greetings, smiling, listening. She said nothing about the rumours. No one mentioned them. But the weight of them floated over every conversation, every lingering glance. She was turning toward the far wall when she felt it. The shift, that sudden awareness, not of being watched, but of watching. Of two pairs of eyes meeting across too many feet and too many bodies. James stood near the far side of the room, speaking to Lord Danforth. He wore black again. Not the flat kind worn by those who didn't care for fashion, but the kind tailored to precision. His coat fit cleanly across the shoulders, his linen stark against his skin, his cravat sharp but unfussy. He looked, as always, composed, unreadable. But when he saw her, he stopped speaking. Their eyes held. And for a moment, no one else in the room existed. Then Lord Danforth said something, and James nodded, and the moment passed. But it had happened. It had shifted something. Eliza turned away before he could cross to her. She didn't want to make it easy. Not yet. She wandered instead toward the refreshment table, accepting a glass of white wine and a sugared plum tartlet. The tart was warm and crisp, the wine dry, both helped settle her. Neither helped nearly enough. "Miss Harland." The voice, low and familiar, came from behind her. Not a question, not an invitation, just her name. She turned slowly. "Mr. Ashworth." Up close, he looked very nearly the same as he had in the library, but there was something taut in his expression, some silent admission in the way he didn't smile. "I didn't know you would be here," she said. "That makes one of us." Her breath caught, a small betrayal, quickly hidden. Lady Chelmsford's assemblies are notoriously difficult to avoid, even when they serve as hunting grounds for rumour. She tilted her head. "And which am I? The hunter or the prey?" He paused. "I haven't decided." She didn't look away. "Neither have I." Someone laughed too loudly behind them. The music paused and shifted. A new waltz began, elegant, slow, threaded through with a minor key. James stepped forward. "May I?" Eliza looked at the hand he offered. She thought of the rumours, of the way people already spoke of them as if it were done. And then she placed her hand in his. "Yes," she said softly. "You may." End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. Lady Chelmsford's Autumn Assembly, later that evening. The final notes of the waltz faded into the warm hush of candlelight and polished floorboards. James released her hand with deliberate care, stepping back with a bow that was perfectly proper, perfectly practiced. His gloves had barely brushed hers during the dance, but it didn't matter. The space between them had felt charged, even then. Eliza dipped into a curtsy, graceful and steady, though her heart was still beating too fast. They had not spoken once during the dance, not a single word. The silence had said enough. The ballroom was too warm now. The crowd had swelled over the course of the evening, and the glow of hundreds of candles reflected off gilded mirrors and bronze sconces, lending the entire room a golden sheen. Ribbons of silk ivy wound through the railings, and bowls of late roses and marigolds lined the edges of the room, their perfume sweet and heavy. Guests drifted toward the supper room, drawn by the soft ring of a bell and the scent of roasted meats and stewed fruit. Footmen carried trays with glasses of sherry, champagne, and little crystal dishes of syllabub dusted in nutmeg. Along the sideboards, a generous spread had been arranged. Carved beef in red wine, game pies glazed to a shine, roasted root vegetables with sage, oyster patties in delicate pastry shells, and a towering centerpiece of sugared pears and walnuts arranged like a crown. Near the back, a smaller table held sweets, plum tarts with golden crusts, almond biscuits dusted with sugar, a syllabub whipped so light it barely held its shape, and a dish of preserved cherries glowing dark red in the candlelight. Eliza accepted a glass of elderflower cordial from a passing tray and stepped to one side, catching her breath. She could feel eyes on her. Not many, just a few. Enough. She hadn't sought this attention, but neither had she fled from it, and that perhaps was why it felt heavier now. James joined her a moment later, his presence at her side neither loud nor invisible. "You didn't flee," he said quietly. She didn't look at him. "Neither did you. You danced with me. You asked." He glanced toward the room, his expression unreadable. "Do you regret it?" Eliza took a slow sip of the cordial. It was cool and fragrant on her tongue, not sweet enough to be indulgent, but refreshing. She turned her head just enough to meet his eyes. "I don't regret the waltz," she said. "I regret how it will be discussed." His gaze lingered. Everything is discussed. What matters is what's remembered. Isn't that worse? Not always. The moment stretched between them, quieter than it should have been in a crowded room. The music had resumed. Something brighter now, less intimate. But Eliza felt none of it. Just the closeness. Just the echo of silence still humming from their dance. "You've changed," he said softly. "I haven't. You've let me see more of you." She looked at him then. "You've looked more closely than most." He didn't deny it. The clink of glasses and the low murmur of conversation continued around them. Somewhere behind the doors, a footman laughed too loudly, and someone dropped a fork. Eliza turned away, placing her empty glass on a nearby tray. "I need air." James stepped back immediately. "Shall I?" "No," she said, not sharply, but final. "I need to be alone." He bowed his head slightly. "Then I'll let you go." She nodded and turned, moving toward the long hallway that led to the terrace. She didn't look back, but she felt it, his gaze, steady and certain, following her out of the room. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. The Terrace. Lady Chelmsford's Assembly. The night air hit her like a tonic, sharp, cool, scented faintly with damp stone and crushed leaves. Eliza stepped onto the terrace and paused, letting the door fall gently shut behind her. The sounds of the assembly dulled instantly, muffled by marble and distance, as if the world inside had no permission to follow her out. The sky was clear, a sweep of stars scattered above the rooftops, glinting like pins on dark velvet. The gardens below were quiet. The lanterns near the hedges burned low, their soft glow catching in the gold embroidery at her hem. She exhaled slowly, pressing her bare fingers to the iron railing. The metal was cold against her skin, grounding in a way the waltz had not been, that had felt like floating, not away from something, but toward it. Toward him. She hadn't meant to dance with him. She hadn't meant to want to. And now, here she was, alone in the dark with her pulse still climbing in her throat, as if her body had kept the rhythm of the music long after it had ended. It had been easier to pretend before, to feign indifference in the daylight, to answer letters and drink tea and carry on as if she were untouched by the way James Ashworth looked at her, as if she didn't feel it beneath her skin, in the quiet after a sentence, in the air that hummed between them. She had told herself she could control it. But perhaps it wasn't about control. Perhaps it was about something else entirely. Something she didn't yet trust herself to name. She moved along the terrace, her slippers soundless on the stone. The fringe of her shawl brushed her knuckles as she walked. It was a new piece, chosen for the occasion. Pale silver silk, fine and light, threaded with darker grey at the edges. It had felt like armour earlier in the evening. Now it felt like a question. What had she given away on that dance floor? What had he seen? The sound of laughter drifted from an open window above, followed by a brief burst of music as the quartet struck up another reel. Eliza didn't move to return. Not yet. Instead, she leaned against the low balustrade and looked up. There was a stillness in her now that hadn't existed before the dance. Not peace, not clarity, but something like honesty. The kind that lives in silence, just before the truth finds its voice. She closed her eyes. She did not want to fall in love with James Ashworth. He was wrong for her in every way that society measured. His name, his fortune, his politics, his position. He was too reserved, too serious, too much a mirror to the parts of herself she had long kept hidden. And yet, he had looked at her like he knew those parts, and he had not turned away. A door creaked somewhere behind her, faint and distant. Eliza opened her eyes, her fingers tightening slightly on the edge of the railing. No one stepped out. Good. She wasn't ready to speak again. She needed this moment to herself, to breathe, to feel, to admit nothing and everything all at once. Because something had changed, not enough to name, but too much to ignore. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16. Harland House, the next morning. The morning after Lady Chelmsford's assembly was the sort of November grey that settled over the city like a damp wool coat. The fire in Eliza's sitting room had been lit early, but it offered little warmth against the heaviness in the air. She sat curled in a low armchair near the hearth, her shawl wrapped tightly around her shoulders, one slippered foot tucked beneath her. A pot of tea had gone lukewarm on the tray beside her, and the slice of honeyed toast on her plate remained untouched. Her maid had brought in a small vase of marigolds to cheer the space, but the sight of them, gold and stubborn and cheerful, only made her feel more tired. She hadn't slept. Not properly. When she'd returned the night before, her body had moved through the motions, greeting her father, brushing out her hair, unpinning the combs at her temples, but her mind had stayed behind, on the ballroom floor, on the terrace, in that quiet space between a glance and a word where James Ashworth had looked at her as if he knew. She didn't know what, exactly, he had seen. But it had been enough to make her heart rise into her throat and her composure fray at the edges. It wasn't just the dance. It was the silence during the dance, the lack of artifice. He hadn't tried to flatter her, hadn't pressed his hand too tightly or made a show of the moment. And somehow, that had made it worse, or better, or far, far more dangerous. Her name had already become part of his story in the mouths of other people. She wasn't sure what would happen if she started to believe it, too. A soft knock came at the sitting-room door, followed by the quiet entrance of her maid with the morning post. 2 letters, both folded crisply and set gently on the small table near the tea tray. "Thank you, Annabelle." The girl bobbed a curtsy and withdrew. Eliza didn't reach for the letters right away. She stared at the fire a moment longer, listening to the hiss of coal and the faint tick of the clock on the mantel. Eventually, she unfolded the first, a note from Margaret, as expected. "You looked cool as a statue last night, which of course only made people talk more. I expect your feet hurt from the waltz. Or perhaps something else does. Should I bring pastries and distractions?" Eliza smiled faintly, but the ache in her chest didn't ease. The second letter was from Lady Chelmsford herself, full of flourishes and the confident tone of a woman who had never once doubted her own influence. "My dear, I am hosting a much smaller supper on Thursday. No music, no spectacle, only civility and gossip. Do come. I've promised 3 people that you and Mr. Ashworth are not yet engaged, and I'd hate to be wrong about it. Yours ever, C." The Eliza folded the letter and set it aside. And then, without allowing herself the time to reconsider, she rose from her chair and crossed to the writing desk. She pulled out a sheet of cream paper and dipped her pen. Her hand didn't shake, not quite, but she could feel her pulse at the base of her throat. "Papa, I find myself in need of a change of air. I believe I shall go to Bath for a short stay. Lady Grantham has long invited me, and the quiet will do me good. I will write upon my arrival. Your affectionate daughter, E. Harland." She sanded the ink, folded the page, and sealed it in blue wax. It wasn't an impulsive decision. It wasn't a punishment, or a retreat, or even a true escape. It was distance. She needed space between herself and the quiet way James Ashworth had made her feel seen. Between herself and the voice inside her that had begun to wonder, without permission, what it would feel like to be seen, completely, and chosen anyway. By mid-morning, her maid had begun packing, lightly, but with purpose. Eliza gave quiet directions. Her sage wool pelisse, the dove-grey gloves, the books she kept for rainy days and hard thoughts. By afternoon, she penned a short note to Lady Grantham and sent it off with a servant. And by nightfall, the carriage was waiting in the drive. She stood in the entrance hall in a deep green travel gown, her bonnet tied neatly, her hands clasped in front of her. Her father had already retired upstairs. He had kissed her cheek at supper and reminded her, gently, without pressure, that she would always be welcome at home. He hadn't asked why she was leaving, and she had been grateful. Outside, the horses stamped and snorted in the cold. The air smelled of coal smoke and rain. She paused at the door and looked back once. The house behind her was quiet. Too quiet, perhaps. But it was the silence ahead that she feared more. The kind where her thoughts could echo. The kind where she might finally admit how far she had already let herself fall. And how much further there was still to go. End of chapter 16. Chapter 17. Sidney Place, Bath, 2 days later. By the time the carriage turned onto the quiet, sunlit street, Eliza could already feel the pressure in her chest begin to ease. Bath looked much the same as it always had, orderly and elegant, softened by the pale honey stone of its crescents and the gentle curve of its streets. The air here was lighter than London's, touched with mineral sharpness from the nearby springs, and the faintest scent of wood smoke drifting from chimneys. The rain that had dogged them most of the journey had lifted that morning, leaving behind a pale, watery sunlight that gleamed off iron railings and damp cobblestones. Eliza sat back against the cushions, her gloved hand resting on the window frame as the carriage slowed in front of number 9, Sidney Place. Her father's letter of introduction had arrived a day ahead of her, and she had sent word to Lady Grantham in advance, but she hadn't expected to feel anything upon arriving, certainly not relief. And yet, as the groom opened the door and she stepped down to the street, she exhaled like someone who'd been holding her breath too long. Behind her, Annabel, her lady's maid, descended from the second carriage with practised ease, and immediately began coordinating with the footman to have the trunks brought inside. Their familiarity spoke of long-standing trust, and of Eliza's very proper decision not to travel alone. She was a Harland, after all. The front door opened before she could reach the steps. "Miss Harland," the housekeeper beamed, bobbing a warm curtsy. "We're ever so pleased to see you. Her ladyship's been expecting you, and cook's been fussing about your supper since dawn." Eliza smiled, touched despite herself. "I'm very grateful to be here. Thank you." The warmth that met her inside was both literal and welcome. A coal fire glowed in the hearth of the modest front hall, polished brass warming the walls with a soft shine. The house smelled faintly of a lemon oil and rising bread. It wasn't as grand as Harland House, but there was something comforting in its scale. A home meant for conversation and soft-footed servants, not displays of wealth. "Her ladyship is out at her card club this afternoon," the housekeeper said as she led the way upstairs. "But she's given clear instructions that you're to rest as soon as you arrive, and that no one is to bother you unless they come bearing tea." Eliza laughed softly. That sounds very much like her. She was shown to a guest chamber overlooking the back garden, a gracious sun-washed space with a canopied bed, a blue and ivory carpet, and wallpaper patterned with ivy leaves just beginning to fade with age. A writing desk sat near the window. A tray of tea and sponge cake waited on the table near the fire, along with a small dish of preserved apricots and a note welcoming her in Lady Grantham's tidy hand. It was, in every way, exactly what she needed. Annabel appeared a moment later, already unfastening latches on the trunk. "I've asked for hot water, miss," she said, her voice low and steady. "The dressing room's been prepared for a bath." Eliza turned, grateful. "Thank you. I think that sounds perfect." Within the hour, the tub was filled and steaming, a faint scent of lavender oil rising with the mist. The dressing room was small, tucked just behind the bedchamber, but the tiled floor was warm beneath her feet, and fresh towels had been laid by the fire. She slipped into the water with a low, steady sigh, her body easing into the heat inch by inch. Her limbs felt heavy, not from the journey, but from something older, more tightly held. She let her head tip back, the warmth creeping across her collarbones and shoulders, and reached for the silver pitcher on the nearby stool. Slowly, carefully, she poured the warm water through her hair, dark strands falling loose around her face and curling at her neck. She lathered it with a bar of muslin-wrapped soap that smelled of rosemary and lemon balm, her fingers working carefully through the tangle. The scent and heat calmed her, but the thoughts did not stop. She hadn't wanted to think of James Ashworth, but she did. Not just the way he'd looked at her on the terrace, not just the feel of his hand at her waist, or the silence they had stood in without flinching, but the sense of being known, seen. She rinsed the soap from her hair, the water trickling down her back, and closed her eyes against the thought. She had come here to escape it, but it had followed her, quietly, like something tied to her breath. Later, dressed in a soft white flannel robe, Eliza sat before the fire in her chamber, hair still damp and falling loose down her back. Annabel had laid out her brush and a second pot of tea, then retired with the quiet competence of someone who understood when her presence was no longer needed. The fire crackled low. Eliza lifted the brush and began slowly drawing it through her hair, stroke by stroke. Steam curled faintly from the strands, still warm from the bath, and the scent of lavender lingered in the air. She stared into the fire as she brushed, the rhythm steadying her body, if not her thoughts. She hadn't told him she was coming. She had no intention of writing. And still, she couldn't quite convince herself he was gone from her mind. He hadn't made a declaration, but he had said enough. And she had felt something in return, something she did not want to name. Not here. Not yet. But as the firelight flickered against the walls and the brush stilled in her hand, she knew one thing with unsettling certainty. Distance would not make her forget, and silence would not unmake what had already begun. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18. Bath, the next morning. Eliza rose early the next morning, before the bells of St. Swithin's had rung their hour, and dressed without ceremony. The rain had not returned. The sky was pale and dry, tinted faintly gold at the edges, and Bath streets gleamed as though they had been scrubbed clean overnight. From the upper windows of Sidney Place, she could see the wide avenue stretching towards Sidney Gardens, where the autumn leaves lay in rust-coloured curls across the gravel paths. By the time she descended for breakfast, the house was stirring gently to life. The scent of warm bread and lemon polish lingered in the air, and a fine blue china pot of orange pekoe tea had already been placed by the hearth in the morning room. Eliza sat in quiet contentment as a footman entered and set a plate before her. A golden scone, still warm from the oven, waited beside a small dish of clotted cream and strawberry preserve so dark and glossy it caught the light like lacquer. She split the scone and spread the cream with slow, practiced care, then added a delicate spoonful of the preserve. The first bite was buttery and rich, with just enough sweetness to warm her from the inside out. The tea was bright and fragrant, grounding her in the stillness of the moment. She ate slowly, the hush of the house settling around her like a second shawl. No footmen announcing callers, no rustle of gowns in the corridor, no whispered commentary from curious acquaintances, just the soft crackle of the fire and the calm assurance of being somewhere that asked nothing of her. By 9:30, she was dressed for a walk. She chose a moss-green pelisse with simple silver buttons, layered over a velvet Spencer jacket, and matched it with dove-grey gloves. Annabel stood ready with her bonnet, a soft felt trimmed with a charcoal ribbon and narrow brim that shaded her eyes just enough. "Shall I accompany you, miss?" her maid asked as she tied the ribbon. Eliza smiled faintly. "No, thank you. I won't go far. I think a quiet walk will do me good." Annabel hesitated, thoughtful. "You might find it less quiet than expected." "Oh. There's a concert in the pump room this morning. Not a grand one. Local families, retired gentlemen, a few visitors from London." Eliza raised an eyebrow but said nothing. She hadn't come to Bath to see anyone. But Bath had its own way of putting people in one another's paths, sometimes more gently than London, but just as certainly. Outside, the air was fresh and cool. The walk to the pump room was pleasant, her boots tapping lightly on the paving stones. Bath was already filling with its usual morning rhythm. Shopkeepers swept their thresholds, children ran beneath balconies, and the scent of baking drifted from tea rooms and kitchens. The pump room, with its grand facade and tall windows, stood just beyond the abbey, quiet but stately, its elegant columns catching the light. A string trio played softly inside, their notes drifting faintly out through the open doors, and the usual collection of respectable guests moved about the space with easy familiarity. Eliza stepped inside and removed her gloves slowly. The room was warm and bright. The musicians were mid-piece, playing something soft and meandering. The air smelled faintly of warm stone and minerals, with occasional bursts of orange peel and perfume as guests passed by. A few ladies turned to glance at her, not rudely, but with the quiet curiosity that followed her wherever she went. She didn't linger in the centre of the room. Instead, she moved toward one of the tall windows, placing her hand lightly on the sill. The glass felt cool beneath her fingertips. Outside, the courtyard glowed beneath the pale morning sun, and a breeze stirred the last of the autumn leaves. She had come for solitude, but now that she stood there, wrapped in music and murmured voices, she felt something else flickering beneath her calm. Not peace, not exactly, but the sense of something about to happen. And then, without turning, she felt it. That unmistakable shift in the air. Awareness. Not imagined. Not hoped for. Known. She turned her head just slightly, slowly, and saw him. Across the room, standing near a marble pillar, James Ashworth spoke to a gentleman she did not recognize. His profile was familiar and impossible to mistake. The clean line of his jaw, the straight posture, the measured stillness of someone who rarely rushed but always noticed. His coat was a dark grey, tailored close to the shoulders, and his gloves were tucked neatly beneath his arm. He wasn't looking at her. Not yet. But she felt it anyway. A prickle at the back of her neck, the quiet tightening beneath her ribs, the certainty of being seen before his eyes had even found her. Her breath caught, just faintly. Not from surprise, but from the fragile tension between certainty and longing. She turned her gaze back to the window, carefully, deliberately. Let him come, or not. She would not move. Not this time. But beneath her composed exterior, something had shifted. She wanted to know what he had come to say. And for the first time, she wasn't sure she would stop him from saying it. End of chapter 18. Chapter 19. Sidney Gardens, late morning. Eliza left the pump room before the musicians finished their second set. She slipped through the crowd with practiced grace, her posture serene, her pace unhurried. But her pulse had quickened, and her gloves, still clutched loosely in one hand, felt warm against her palm. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. By the time she reached Sidney Gardens, the wind had picked up faintly, rustling the leaves across the gravel paths like scattered letters. It was quiet here, save for the occasional distant voice or the creak of a park bench. The fountains trickled steadily. She turned off the main walk and made her way toward a smaller path that ran beside the canal, a place she remembered from childhood visits, secluded enough, private enough. She wasn't certain why she'd come here, only that she couldn't remain in that warm, bright room with James Ashworth standing across it, silent, composed, and very much present. The path curved gently around a small grove of trees. Sunlight fell through the thinning canopy in dappled patches. She paused near a wooden bench and let out a slow, steadying breath. "You left rather quickly," She turned. James stood at the edge of the path, hands at his sides, posture careful but not tense. His hair was a little tousled, as though he'd walked fast to catch her and hadn't bothered to smooth it again. His coat was open, the edge fluttering in the breeze. "I didn't realise I was being watched," she said. "I wasn't watching," he said evenly. "Not until you turned away." She tilted her head. "And what did you come to say?" He approached slowly, not presumptuously, but as if he understood this moment mattered, that it had been waiting for some time. "I wasn't certain I would say anything," he said, "but I've found I'm increasingly poor at staying silent where you're concerned." She raised a brow. "That's a rather large shift for a man who once wrote to me with all the warmth of a philosophy lecture." I was trying not to say too much. "And now?" He stopped a few paces from her, close enough to hear her breath, but not near enough to touch. "Now," he said quietly, "I'm trying not to lose you before I've had the chance to deserve you." The words hung between them, startling and steady, like a match struck in a dim room. Eliza didn't speak at first. She looked away toward the leaves tumbling across the path. Her heart felt like it had stepped into something larger than it knew how to carry. "You followed me," she said. "Yes." "Why?" He hesitated. "Because I was afraid I would never see you again, and because I couldn't let you leave thinking I felt nothing." She looked back at him. "I never thought that." "No," he said, "but I never gave you anything else to believe in." A silence stretched between them, not cold, but suspended. A moment of choice. Eliza spoke first. "I came here because I didn't know what to do with how I felt. About you, about the way you looked at me in London. It unsettled me." "I didn't mean to unsettle you." "I know," she said softly. "That's what unsettled me most." He took one slow step forward. "Then tell me to go. Say the word, and I'll leave Bath today." Eliza didn't answer right away. She stared at him, this man who had once been a foil, a challenger, a voice across a ballroom with too many opinions and no place in her world. But that wasn't who he was now. Now he was a man standing in front of her in the autumn quiet, asking her to see him. "I don't want you to go," she said. James exhaled, something shifting behind his eyes. "And I don't want to regret this," she added. "You won't," he said simply. She took a step toward him. "Don't be so sure." "I'm not," he said, "but I'm sure of how I feel." Her breath caught, and she hated how much it mattered. How much he mattered. James looked down at her, the wind tugging at his coat, the leaves at their feet, and then, with something like quiet resolve, he said, "Eliza Harland, I love you. I have loved you since I realised you weren't just clever, but kind. And since you called me insufferable in front of half of Bath." She laughed, startled, and then, with no audience but the birds and the trees, he took her hand. She let him. His voice softened. "You don't need to answer me now. I know I'm not what your family expected. I'm not what you expected. But I would ask for the chance, not to convince you, but to be with you on your terms." She stared at him, quiet, unsmiling. And then she rose onto her toes and kissed him, not fiercely, not impulsively, just finally. When she pulled back, her voice was quiet. "I don't know what comes next," she said. "I do," he replied. "But we'll take it slowly, if that's what you want." Eliza nodded once, her hand still in his. Yes, she said. It is. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20. Bath, 2 days later. The letter arrived in the late morning, thick with her father's seal and scented faintly of wax and old ink. Annabel brought it up with a wary look and a silver tray, as though it might explode upon opening. Eliza waited until she was alone before breaking the seal. My dearest Eliza, it has reached my ears, though not, I'm sorry to say, from you, that you are keeping company in Bath with a man who is neither titled nor of our social standing. I will not insult your intelligence by telling you whom you may love, but I would be remiss in my duty as your father if I did not remind you of the life you were raised to expect, and the responsibilities you carry because of that privilege. You are not an ordinary woman, and your path will never be ordinary. Choose with care. Your affectionate father, R.H. She read it twice, then folded it once, precisely, and placed it back on her writing desk without so much as a sigh. She knew what he meant. But what he didn't understand, and perhaps never would, was that James Ashworth had never asked her to be ordinary. Later that afternoon, a note arrived by hand. Not from her father, not from Lady Grantham, not from anyone with opinions or advice. Just one line in James's hand. Will you walk with me at 4 o'clock? She didn't hesitate. Sidney Gardens was quiet again, the leaves beginning to gather in soft, rust-coloured drifts along the edges of the paths. The air was still, the light low and golden, and the hum of the city felt far away. Eliza arrived first. Not by accident. She stood by the same bench where they had last spoken, her gloved hands tucked neatly before her, her bonnet tied more loosely than usual, strands of hair curling against her cheeks. She didn't turn when she heard his steps. Thank you for coming, James said behind her. She smiled faintly. You never did say why you left the pump room that morning. He stepped beside her. Because you were there. And today? Because I wanted to ask you something. Properly. He paused, watching her face. I haven't always had the right words with you, Eliza. I've been guarded and stubborn and too careful for my own good. But you've been patient. You've challenged me. You've taught me more about courage than I ever expected to learn from a woman who once refused to dance with me purely out of principle. Her mouth twitched. I don't recall ever refusing you purely out of principle. I'm glad to hear it, he said, because I'm about to ask you for something far more foolish. And then, without a trace of performance or hesitation, he went down on one knee. Eliza's breath caught. Miss Harland, he said, with a quiet steadiness that made her heart ache, I love you. Not in the way people speak of it in drawing rooms or novels, but honestly, fiercely, with the full understanding that you will challenge me for the rest of my life, and that I will be better for it. He opened a small box, velvet-lined, simple, and inside was a ring of gold with a single deep sapphire framed by tiny diamonds. No dowry, no fortune, no conditions, he said. Only this, your hand, your wit, your fire, and the promise that I will never ask you to be anything less than exactly who you are. The wind moved gently between them. Eliza said nothing for a moment. Then she reached out slowly and took the ring from the box herself. She met his eyes. I'm not marrying you out of rebellion, she said. I know. I'm not marrying you to shock my father or escape society. I never thought you were. I'm marrying you, she said, because I would rather face a lifetime of sharp tongues and sideways glances than spend a single year wondering what it might have been like to love you openly. James rose, and she stepped into his arms before he could speak another word. 2 letters arrived at Sidney Place within the week. The first, in a hand Eliza knew by heart, bore the Harland seal and a faint smudge of ink in the lower corner, as though it had been written quickly or in some agitation. Eliza, if I thought your happiness lay in ambition or advantage, I would fight harder. But I have seen your eyes when you speak of him, and though I don't yet know the man, I know you. You are not careless. You do not leap without cause. You have never asked me for permission. I will not insult you by offering it now. But if you bring him to Harland House before Christmas, I will have a bottle of French brandy and a seat by the fire ready for him. With affection, your father. Eliza folded the letter carefully and smiled, not because it was warm, but because it was honest, which from her father was affection in its truest form. The second letter came not by post, but by hand. Lady Grantham herself, arriving with no warning, no footman, and a fur-lined mantle that swept the corridor like a duchess announcing war. She swept into the drawing-room without waiting to be announced. "I suppose it's too late to talk you out of it," she said, eyes bright with mischief. "Far too late," Eliza replied. Lady Grantham removed her gloves with great ceremony. "Then I shall talk you into it instead. I've already spoken with my dressmaker. She has opinions about necklines, but she's quick and she owes me a favour." Eliza blinked. "You're offering to help plan the wedding." "Don't be absurd. I'm offering to control it entirely." Eliza laughed, truly and freely, as Lady Grantham settled beside her with a sigh. "I never thought you'd surprise me, Eliza Harland," she said. "But I'm glad you did. I never thought you'd approve." "Oh, I don't," she said crisply. "He's dreadfully clever and just as likely to argue with you at breakfast as he is to kiss you in public, but you'll be bored by anything less, and you'll need someone to keep you sharp." "I suppose I've chosen well, then." "You have," she said, softer now. "Very well indeed." End of chapter 20. Epilogue. Harland House, late spring. The morning of the wedding broke soft and silver, as if the world had decided not to outshine her. Eliza woke early, before the house stirred, and sat for a long moment at the window of her childhood bedroom. The gardens were just beginning to bloom again, wisteria clinging to the stone walls, the earliest roses still curled in their buds. A breeze moved gently through the long grass, and somewhere in the distance she heard the faint whinny of a restless horse. She was not afraid. She had thought she might be. Not of marriage, but of what it meant to step fully into something she had chosen for herself, without caveats, without compromise. But she felt calm, whole, like someone returning to a place they hadn't known they missed until the door opened again. Annabel helped her dress, humming quietly as she buttoned the back of her gown. It was not overly grand, no sweeping train, no showy embroidery, but the silk was fine and cream-coloured, catching the morning light with every step. The bodice was modest but graceful, edged in antique lace from her mother's wedding handkerchief, and her veil, sheer and light as breath, was pinned with a silver comb shaped like a swallow in flight. The same one she had worn the night she first danced with James. "You look lovely, miss," Annabel said, adjusting the veil. Eliza met her reflection's eyes and smiled. "Yes, I think I do." The ceremony was held beneath the great elm tree in the west garden, where a simple arch had been raised and wound with vines and pale lilac. The grass was soft underfoot, and birdsong threaded through the air as guests gathered in rows of white-painted chairs. James stood waiting, tall, composed, striking in a navy tailcoat, his hair neatly combed, a single white rose pinned to his lapel. When Eliza stepped into the garden, the world stilled. Her father, stiff but proud, offered her his arm. Lady Grantham dabbed at one eye and claimed it was the wind. Margaret grinned, radiant in seafoam green, and nudged a footman with a basket of rose petals into action. There were vows, simple, honest, and not rehearsed. There was a ring, a gold band warmed by the sun and her hand. There was a kiss, brief but real, met with applause and laughter, and a cheer from someone near the back who was almost certainly not supposed to cheer. Eliza did not stop smiling. Long tables had been laid beneath a white canvas canopy, strung with ribbons that fluttered in the breeze. Pale linen cloths, polished silver, and delicate china gleamed in the filtered light. The scent of lavender and early roses drifted on the air as guests found their seats, laughter and light conversation bubbling up like spring water. The food was chosen with quiet care, elegant but not excessive. Plates of buttered asparagus, pigeon pie with rosemary crust, and poached salmon with cucumber sauce were passed between guests. There were petits fours, delicate and jewel-toned, alongside sponge cake layered with strawberries and whipped cream. At the centre of each table stood crystal dishes of raspberry preserve and clotted cream for the warm scones served alongside orange-scented tea and champagne. James raised his glass just once, near the end. "I am not a man of speeches," he said, drawing amused glances. "But I will say this, she could have chosen anyone. And for reasons I still don't entirely understand, she chose me. I will spend the rest of my life making sure that choice never feels small." Eliza met his eyes over the rim of her teacup. "And I will spend mine ensuring you never get the last word." Laughter rippled across the table. Someone, likely Margaret, clinked a glass in approval. Later that evening, the guests had long since toasted, the musicians packed away their instruments, and the lanterns were being lit across the terrace. The sky turned lavender at the edges, and the first stars blinked quietly to life. Eliza stood at the window of her new sitting room, the one adjoining the master bedchamber, her veil set aside, her hair falling in soft waves down her back. She wore a light robe of pearl grey silk, edged in lace, and in her hands was a cup of warm tea someone had thoughtfully left waiting. The door creaked open behind her. "You're late," she said softly. "I was told Lady Grantham had to be off the property before I was allowed to enter." She smiled without turning. He came to stand behind her, the lines of his coat now gone, replaced with the ease of familiarity. He touched her shoulder gently, then her hand. "Well," she said, "we did it." "We did," he murmured, drawing her close. "And we are not undone." She turned in his arms and kissed him, not because it was expected, but because she could, freely, completely, and without restraint. Later, as they lay beneath the gauzy canopy of their bed, the windows open to the sounds of night, he brushed a thumb along her jaw and whispered, "Tell me, Mrs. Ashworth, was it worth it?" Eliza smiled, her eyes soft and unguarded. "Yes," she said, "and I'd choose you again tomorrow." The end.